Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on when we are listening to this. We're going to go through the rest of Pope John Paul II's life and just get everything we need to know about him. We ended yesterday talking about love and responsibility, his great early work. Like I said, after reading Love and Responsibility, Pope Paul VI invited John Paul II to Vatican City to help him write what would become his encyclical Humanae Vitae, which was his most influential encyclical in his papacy. Here's an image of John Paul II coming into Yankee Stadium to celebrate Mass. So he was another pope who visited the United States and celebrated Mass for us in Yankee Stadium. A year after being elected Pope, John Paul II began a series of Wednesday audiences on which he spoke of the topic of the human person based on what God reveals to us in creation of the human person. Wednesday audiences. What is an audience? Every day, the Pope prays the Angelus, actually, with anybody gathered in St. Peter's Square. So if you are in Rome and it is noon and you are in St. Peter's Square, the big open area in front of St. Peter's Basilica, the Pope will emerge from his apartment right overlooking the square, and they have a microphone set up, and he greets everybody. You can see him, and he prays the Angelus with everybody, and then he gives a little talk, a little homily almost. And on Wednesdays, when John Paul II was Pope, he began to give a continuing conversation, a continuing homily, if you will, on this topic of the theology of the body, of how did God make us, and what does that teach us about him, about his love for us, about what our job is, our vocation is as human people, as human beings. It was largely based on the book of Genesis. He explains how, because we have been made in God's image and likeness as both man and woman, then man and woman are united in marriage. They are able to imitate the love that exists in God. John Paul II draws a connection between the Trinity and the human family. He says that God the Father so much loved God the Son that the Holy Spirit came from their mutual love. That's how the Trinity kind of is born and organized. Just like when a husband loves a wife, their love is manifest in the new love that is found in a child. And that's the image and likeness of God. That's where that connection is made. The Trinity is a communion of persons united in love. Therefore, marriage becomes a communion of love that is not so different than the love of God. In the Bible, it talks about how when a man and a woman are married, they become one flesh. This idea of one flesh, that they are no longer two, but one. And the phrasing isn't that they're just one, that they are one flesh. It's involving the very tangible idea that their bodies are no longer two, but one. And that unity is demonstrated in the Trinity. He makes this huge connection. The love between a husband and wife in matrimony ought to exhibit 4 distinct qualities, he says. In marriage, just like in the Trinity, love must be free, total, faithful, and fruitful. Free comes at no cost. Total, it's all-encompassing. Faithful, it's never-ending. And fruitful, good comes from their love. That is an image of the Trinity in marriage. And this is a huge teaching because we don't talk about marriage this way that often. His theology of the body reshaped the way the church speaks of and understands human sexuality and is considered one of the Pope's greatest gifts to the church. Next, Vatican II. Like his immediate predecessor, John Paul II believed it was his mission to put the teachings of the Second Vatican Council into effect. He did great things to make sure this took place. John Paul II says many times Christ fully reveals man to himself and makes his supreme calling clear. That's from Gaudium et Spes, from the Vatican II documents. He emphasizes that our relationship with Christ is what makes our life make sense. The second teaching builds upon the first. John Paul II also said many, many times, quoting from Gaudium et Spes, that document in Vatican II, that the human person, who is the only creature on earth which God willed for itself, cannot find himself except through the sincere gift of himself. This concept of the gift of self, that we are called as people made in the image and likeness of Christ to give of ourselves in some way. It manifests itself in big ways in how we will one day give ourselves to our spouse forever, or we give ourselves to a vocation like the religious life or the priesthood, and that is a complete gift of self, that we're no longer living just for our own needs and our own wills, but for others. I think about St. Augustine when I think about this, because Augustine, remember, in his early life, he was trying to just fulfill his own passions, his own desires, his own needs, and he found it empty. He found that it didn't bring him any happiness. But it wasn't until he gave his life fully for others in his vocation to be a priest that he found meaning in his life. This is a big, big emphasis of Pope John Paul II. The idea of living your life with the purpose to be a gift to others is the opposite of the way of the world. John Paul's life was lived in this way, as we are all the saints. The Catechism of the Catholic Church. Following the Second Vatican Council, they thought it would be a good idea to renew the Catechism. The Catechism was written and rewritten many times in the history of the Church. It's not the Bible. It's a church's work, so it's not something that God revealed. It's something that the Church kind of organized and created. It's a very useful tool, and it had gotten a little outdated. The old version of the Catechism was such that it didn't really explain so much why, it explained what. So it was written in like a Q&A kind of format, like, who is God? Question, answer. God is the creator of all things. That's all it would say. And it wouldn't say much more than that. And we live in a world now where we need to know answers for things, not just memorize answers for things. We need to know the real why behind things. So in 1992, John Paul II published a new edition of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, and it was organized in a very profound way with 4 parts. The Profession of Faith, the Apostles' Creed, and it went through all the things that we say we believe in the Apostles' Creed. Second part is the celebration of the Christian mystery, also known as the sacraments. So it goes through each of the sacraments. Then in life in Christ, including the 10 Commandments. So it went through the teachings of Jesus. It went through the teachings of the 10 Commandments. And Christian prayer, including the Lord's Prayer. And that goes through that way that Jesus taught us how to pray. So those 4 things are how the new catechism is organized, and that's the one we use today. So big things. John Paul II issued this new catechism. And then there's this concept of the new evangelization. The new evangelization. Why is it new? We know what the word evangelization means. It means to bring the gospel to people. And in the old days, when we had missionaries in Europe going to the tribes that destroyed the Roman Empire, they had not ever heard of Jesus, or they didn't know anything about the Jewish history and the Messiah coming. So to evangelize them was a big deal. It was to teach them a new thing, a very new thing, and hope that they find the peace of the gospel and the joy of the gospel and adopt it into their lives. Well, we are in a new time right now. Most of the world, in the modern world, has heard of the gospel. They've heard of Jesus, and they know who the Catholics are and everything. And not everybody follows the way of the gospel. So what do we need to do? It's not to evangelize them, to teach them about Jesus. It's about to teach people who already know Jesus why they need to know him more, why they need to love him more, why they need to adopt him more. Some would say that there is no longer need for missionaries and that they are no longer a need for evangelization, despite This not being true, John Paul II taught the church that there needs to be a new evangelization of the modern world to bring the gospel back to a world that had lost it or forgotten it. John Paul II believed that this was one of the most crucial missions for the church today, to re-Christianize the world. That's something that Father Chaminade wanted to do as well during the French Revolution. To re-Christianize the world in places that had already heard the gospel, but who had lost the meaning of the faith in Jesus Christ that had once existed. This requires people to overcome their own apathy in order to reignite their faith, to get people back on board with our faith. Next, his assassination attempt. Remember, John Paul II grew up in Nazi Poland, and then he grew up later after that in communist Poland. John Paul II was also influential in bringing down communism. He spoke out openly against communism in the Soviet Union. After a 1979 visit to Poland, a political movement began, which ultimately led to the election of the first non-communist leader 20 years later. So John Paul II wanted to visit Poland when he was Pope. The Polish authorities did not want this to happen, but he was a Polish citizen. You can't keep a citizen out of their own country, so they had to allow it. When John Paul II came to Poland, they thought there'd be riots. They thought there'd be, outbreak in the streets. And the authorities decided they were not going to put any police out. So that way they would allow the riots to happen and then use that as a reason for why the Pope would never be allowed back. So they didn't have any police out. And guess what happened? No riots, nothing. Everybody came out to see the Pope. They loved that Poland had a Pope. And John Paul II inspired them to overthrow peacefully the Communist Party. He brought down communism without a single bullet being fired. He brought down communism by influencing and inspiring the Polish people. There was a political movement that grew out of this known as Solidarity. This was a problem with the Soviet leaders in Poland who blamed the movement squarely on the inspiration of the Polish Pope. The Soviets allowed Wojtyła to be named a bishop. Remember, they didn't think he would do anything. They thought he was the one that was the safest pick. Remember when the Archbishop of Krakow died and they rejected all the other nominations except for this young priest in Krakow? They thought was a simple guy and nobody would ever, he would never do anything bad. But guess what? Now he's the Pope, and now he's coming back to Poland, and now he's taking down the whole regime. Now that Wojtyła was Pope, Soviet communists greatly feared that they would lose more power throughout Europe. To stop this, in 1981, the Soviets moved to have the Pope assassinated. The Soviet leaders hired Mehet Ali Agiyevska. I have no idea how to say that guy's last name. They hired this guy who was a Muslim terrorist from Turkey to assassinate the Pope. They wanted him out. They feared that the whole communist Eastern Europe and Russia would all come down because of this guy, because they already saw it happening in Poland. So they hired a terrorist to take out the Pope. And he tried to assassinate him on May 13th. Here you see in the book, there's more, you can slide through. I can't do that right now because these are screenshots. You see that the guy was this far away from John Paul II when he was coming through on the Pope Mobile on May 13th, 1981. He was shot point blank. He made his way through the papal procession. He drew his pistol, fired multiple rounds at John Paul II from the close range. John Paul II had almost 70% blood loss. He was brought to the hospital after 5 hours of surgery and weeks of time spent in the hospital. John Paul II makes a full recovery. The date is kind of important. May 13th is the day of Our Lady of Fatima. That's what date she first appeared in Portugal. The Pope believed that on this day, the Blessed Virgin Mary paid special attention to protect his father in the assassination attempt. John Paul II would say that one finger fired the gun and another finger guided the bullet, and that's what he believes is Our Lady, because it missed hitting his aorta by millimeters. For everything that happened to me that day, the Pope says, I felt the extraordinary motherly protection and care, which turned out to be stronger than the deadly bullet, thinking about his experience. John Paul visited his prisoner, the assassin in prison, and met him and forgave him personally. And that man was later released after his sentence was served, and he was baptized and has become a Christian since then. An amazing story of forgiveness, an amazing story of compassion and of conversion. The Fatima connection continues because remember in the Fatima visions, the children, so they saw a bishop dressed in white, falling as though dead, being shot. This is the third secret of Our Lady of Fatima, that the Pope would be assassinated someday but survive. Lastly, on this page, World Youth Day. We've heard about it. The next one's in Portugal. It actually got delayed because of the pandemic right now. So it's in a couple more years, but the next one's going to be in Portugal. John Paul II had a vibrant love for the youth of the church. Starting in 1986, John Paul II instituted the first World Youth Day in dioceses of the church all over the world, celebrated on Palm Sunday. This is a day to honor the youth, a day to call the youth in, to make us realize we're parts of the church. Now, about every other year, the church celebrates a global World Youth Day that is a global gathering. The first International World Youth Day was held in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Interesting that's where Pope Francis is from. And every few years we gather, and here's a huge picture of Toronto. I'm in there somewhere. I think I was there, definitely was there, but I'm way back there. Kellenberg got, somehow they got a sweet deal, and Kellenberg sat right in the front row here in Toronto. But that was a huge gathering that we have. And what is World Youth Day? It's a day where, or it's several days, it's 5 or 6 days, and there's different events that happen, different concerts, different people are there to address those gathered, and it's an amazing thing. You really see the faith from the world all gathered in one place. Kellenberg takes students whenever it has the opportunity to. They did one this year. No, it was last year. Last year was in Panama. And the last year's seniors went during January because that's when summer is down there. But it's usually during the summer. It's been in many different places. And the next one coming up, like I said, is in Portugal. So you will not be in Kellenberg when that takes place, but that doesn't mean you can't go. Afterwards, there's many groups that go. Most people go in a group. They don't go as an individual. Dioceses go. If you're in college, your college might have a group that's going over as well. I went to Toronto when I was in high school. I went to Germany. It was in Germany when I was in college, and I've only gone to 2. But they're amazing events. In his last years, John Paul II was described as a volcano of energy by one of his secretaries. He was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, which is a degenerative neurological disease, which means it only gets worse over time. And this declined the use of his motor skills. There's no cure for this. In the final years of the Pope's life, his physical energy definitely declined, but his mental acuteness remained sharp as ever. In his final days, he lost the ability to speak. He suffered from pneumonia and had to have a tracheotomy, so he could no longer speak. He appeared at the window of the papal apartment, to greet the crowds in one of his last appearances. But he was no longer able to say anything, so he just gave a blessing with his hand. 2 days later, John Paul II died of pneumonia and bronchitis. The Pope was 84 years old. This is a shot of all these bishops that attended the Pope's funeral mass. The papal funeral was one of the most widely watched things on television history. It was reportedly watched by 4 billion people worldwide. That's how big of an impact John Paul II had on the world, not just to Catholics, but to people all over the world. I remember seeing a picture of the funeral, and you saw Presidents Jimmy Carter sitting next to George H.W. Bush, sitting next to Bill Clinton, sitting next to George W. Bush, the current president. You would never get 4 presidents and past presidents ever together in a room for anything less than an event like this. So an amazing life, an amazing person, an amazing pope, and definitely one of the greatest saints we've had in the last 1,000 years, I think. So that's it. Thank you very much. And we're done for today. We will have our activity day tomorrow and be back again on Thursday. Awesome. Thanks very much. I'll be around for questions afterwards. Take care. Bye-bye.